Life can sometimes throw us into moments of uncertainty, moments when we wonder if what we've been praying for will ever come to pass. But let me tell you something right now. God's answer is coming. You might not see it yet, but it's on its way. And I'm here to remind you that faith is what's going to get you through it. Sometimes when we're facing the hardest moments in life, it feels like we're walking through a storm with no end in sight. Our hearts are heavy with questions, our minds filled with doubts, and we start to wonder if what we've been praying for will ever come to pass. It feels like God's silence is deafening, like the heavens are closed and we can't see a way out. But I'm here to tell you, God's answer is coming, even if you don't see it yet. There's a power in waiting, a strength that's built in the moments when we're uncertain, unsure of what the future holds. God's timing is perfect, even when it doesn't align with our own. The challenge is in the waiting. The challenge is holding on to faith when things don't look like they're changing. But let me remind you, just because you can't see it doesn't mean it's not coming. There's something about faith that makes the impossible possible. It's not about seeing the end result or knowing exactly how things will turn out. It's about trusting in the one who holds everything in his hands. Faith isn't about feeling good all the time. It's about standing firm even when you feel weak. It's about pressing forward even when the road ahead is unclear. You have to keep walking even when the finish line feels so far away. God's answer is coming. Trust in that. When you're praying, when you're asking, it's easy to get discouraged. We live in a world that thrives on instant results. We want things now, and when we don't see the immediate response, we begin to wonder if God even hears us. But I want you to know that just because you don't see the answer doesn't mean God isn't working. Sometimes God is working behind the scenes, orchestrating things in ways you can't even imagine. What you see in front of you is just a part of the process. The full picture is still being painted. In the Bible, we see time and time again that God's people had to wait. They waited for promises to be fulfilled, for prayers to be answered, for deliverance to come. Abraham waited for the promise of a son. The Israelites waited in captivity for freedom. Even Jesus' disciples had to wait for the Holy Spirit to come and guide them. Waiting is part of the journey. God's answer is coming, but He needs you to stay in faith through the process. You might be at a point where you feel like you're running out of time. You've been waiting for so long and feels like nothing is happening. But I promise you, God is never late. He's always on time. The truth is, His timing is better than yours. And when He does answer, it will be exactly what you needed, even if it wasn't what you expected. There are things that only God can see that need to be put into place before His answer can fully manifest. And when it comes, it will be in a way that blows your mind. The hardest part is often the waiting. It's in those moments that your faith is tested the most. When you're standing there in the middle of your circumstance, looking around, wondering if God's going to come through, that's when you need to dig deep and trust Him. Trust Him even when you don't understand. Trust Him even when the odds seem stacked against you. Trust Him when it feels like the world is telling you to give up. Stay in faith. Now, I'm not saying it's easy. It's not. Waiting is one of the hardest things you'll ever do, but it's also one of the most powerful things you can do. You don't have to have all the answers. You just need to trust that the God who has been faithful in the past will continue to be faithful in the future. He hasn't forgotten you. He hasn't forgotten the prayers you've prayed. He hasn't forgotten the promises He made. His answer is coming. Maybe it's already on its way and you just can't see it yet. You're not waiting in vain. Your faith is not in vain. Every time you choose to trust, even when it doesn't make sense, you're building something strong in your spirit. And when that answer finally comes, you'll realize it was worth the wait. It was worth the struggle. It was worth staying faithful through the process. God has heard your cry. He knows your heart, and He's working things out for your good. Don't give up. Don't lose heart. Keep walking. Keep praying. Keep trusting. God's answer is coming, and when it does, it's going to be more than you could have ever imagined. Trust in His timing, trust in His process, and trust that He has something good in store for you. Faith is trusting when you can't see the way. It's easy to believe when everything is going well, when doors are opening, when prayers are being answered quickly. But real faith, the kind that moves mountains, is the faith that holds on when everything around you says to let go. It's the faith that stays strong when the road ahead is unclear, when you don't have all the answers, when you feel lost and don't know which way to turn. That's the kind of faith that God is looking for, the kind that doesn't waver in the waiting. There will be times in life when you feel like you're walking through complete darkness, like you're standing in the middle of a storm with no shelter in sight. The prayers you've prayed seem to go unanswered. The dreams you've held on to feel like they're slipping away, and nothing seems to be working in your favor. But faith is choosing to trust God even in those moments. Faith says, I don't see the way, but I know God has already made one. Faith says, I don't understand what's happening, but I believe that God is still in control. Faith is walking forward when you don't see the next step, believing that God will place solid ground beneath your feet. Faith isn't about having all the answers. It's not about knowing exactly when or how God will move. It's about trusting that He will. It's about resting in the truth that even when life feels uncertain, God is not uncertain. He knows exactly what He's doing. He sees what you can't see. He knows what's ahead, and He's already making a way. Your job isn't to figure it all out. Your job is to trust Him. Your job is to hold on even when you don't understand. One of the hardest things to do is to trust when you can't see. It's human nature to want proof, to want evidence, to want to know exactly how things will turn out before we step forward. But faith doesn't work that way. Faith is stepping out when there's no visible path. Faith is believing for the impossible. Faith is standing firm even when everything around you says to give up. Faith isn't about seeing, it's about believing. God's answer is coming, but you have to stay in faith while you wait. It might not come when you expect it. It might not come how you expect it, but it's coming. And in the waiting, God is building something in you. He's strengthening you. He's preparing you for what's ahead. If He gave you the answer too soon, you might not be ready for it. If He opened the door before the right time, you might not be able to walk through it. God sees what you can't see, and He knows what's best for you. So you have to trust Him, even when you don't understand. There are going to be moments when your faith is tested. There will be days when you feel like giving up, when doubt creeps in, when fear tries to take over. But that's when you have to remind yourself of who God is. That's when you have to look back at all the times He has come through before. He has never failed you, and He's not about to start now. The same God who answered your prayers before is the same God who will answer them again. The same God who made a way before will make a way again. He's faithful even when we don't see it. You may feel like you're in a season of waiting, like you've been praying and believing, but nothing is changing. But just because you don't see it yet doesn't mean God isn't working. Just because the answer hasn't come yet doesn't mean it's not on its way. Some of the greatest blessings come after the longest waits. Some of the most powerful breakthroughs happen when we refuse to give up. When you stay in faith, you're setting yourself up for a miracle. When you keep trusting, even when it's hard, you're positioning yourself for God to move in a way that you never expected. Faith isn't about how you feel. It's about what you believe. Your feelings will tell you to quit. Your emotions will tell you it's never going to happen. But faith says, I will trust God no matter what. Faith says, I will stand even when it feels like nothing is happening. Faith says, God is working even when I can't see it. That's the kind of faith that moves mountains. That's the kind of faith that sees miracles. God's timing is perfect. He knows exactly what He's doing. And if you stay in faith, if you keep trusting even when you can't see the way, you will see His answer in your life. It's coming. Keep believing, keep standing, keep trusting. Faith is knowing that even when the way is unclear, God has already gone ahead and made a way. God is never late. He's always on time. When we pray, when we ask, when we seek, we often have our own ideas of when God should move, when He should answer, and how He should do it. But God does not operate on our schedule. His timing is not our timing. What may seem like a delay to us is not a delay to Him. He sees the whole picture. He knows the perfect moment to bring His answer into your life. And even though it may feel like nothing is happening, like He is silent, like He is distant, God is always working, always moving, always setting things in place for what He has planned for you. There are moments in life when waiting feels unbearable. You've been faithful, you've been praying, you've been standing, and yet nothing seems to be changing. The temptation to give up, to let go, to stop believing starts creeping in. But just because you don't see it doesn't mean God isn't working. Just because the answer hasn't arrived yet doesn't mean it's not coming. God's timing is intentional. He knows the right moment, the right season, the right opportunity to release what you've been waiting for. And when He does, it will be better than you imagined. Think about all the times in the Bible when it seemed like God was late. When Lazarus was sick, Mary and Martha sent word to Jesus, expecting Him to come right away. But Jesus delayed. By the time He arrived, Lazarus had been dead for 4 days. In their eyes, Jesus was too late. The miracle they were hoping for had passed, but what they saw as a delay was actually divine timing. Jesus wasn't late. He was right on time to perform a greater miracle than they had expected. Instead of healing a sick man, He raised a dead man. Sometimes God delays because He's about to do something greater than what you asked for. God's timing is never rushed, never off course. He sees things you don't see. He knows what's ahead, what needs to be aligned, what has to be prepared before He brings the answer to your prayers. And if you can hold on, if you can trust Him even when you don't understand, you will see that His timing is perfect. You will look back and realize that if He had answered sooner, you might not have been ready. If He had opened that door before its time, you might not have been able to walk through it. God doesn't just want to give you what you're asking for. He wants to give it to you at the right time so that you can fully receive it, fully walk in it, and fully be blessed by it. Sometimes the waiting is where the real work happens. It's in the waiting that faith is built, that character is strengthened, that trust in God is deepened. If God gave you everything immediately, you wouldn't need faith. But faith is developed in the moments when you don't see the answer yet, when you have to believe even when nothing makes sense. Faith says, I trust you, Lord, even though I don't understand. Faith says, I believe you're working even when I don't see movement. Faith is what sustains you in the waiting, what keeps you standing when it feels like nothing is changing. God knows the desires of your heart. He knows what you've been praying for. He knows the tears you've cried, the nights you've spent wondering when things will shift. He sees it all. And He's not ignoring you. He's not overlooking you. He's preparing the perfect answer, the perfect breakthrough, the perfect solution. And when the time is right, nothing can stop it from coming to pass. No delay, no opposition, no circumstance can keep God's answer from reaching you when it's time. The enemy will try to convince you that it's too late, that your time has passed, that what you're believing for isn't going to happen. But the enemy is a liar. If God said it, He will do it. If God promised it, He will bring it to pass. He's not bound by time. He's not limited by circumstances. He's not worried about deadlines. He is sovereign, and He moves when the moment is right. Trust that. Hold on to that. Even when it seems like things are taking too long, remind yourself that God is never late. He's always on time. Stand firm in faith, no matter the circumstances. Life will test you. There will be days when everything feels like it's working against you, when the weight of waiting becomes too heavy to carry, when you start to wonder if God has forgotten you. It's in those moments that faith must rise. It's easy to believe when things are going well, when doors are opening, when prayers are being answered right away. But real faith is proven in the moments when nothing makes sense, when the storm is raging, when the silence from heaven feels deafening. That's when you have to make a choice to stand firm in faith, to believe even when doubt tries to creep in, to trust that God is still working even when you can't see it. Faith isn't about your circumstances. It's not about what things look like right now. It's about knowing that God is bigger than what you see, that He is in control even when things feel out of control. The enemy will try to shake you, to make you question if God is really going to come through. He will whisper lies, telling you that your situation is impossible, that nothing is changing, that you're wasting your time believing. But the enemy is a liar. He wants you to give up before you see the breakthrough, to walk away before the answer comes. That's why you have to stand firm, to refuse to be moved by what you see, to hold on to what God has promised, even when everything around you tells you to let go. There will be moments when it feels like the pressure is too much, when the waiting feels unbearable, when your faith is being stretched beyond what you thought you could handle. But that's when you need to dig your heels in and refuse to waver. Standing firm doesn't mean you won't have moments of doubt or moments when you feel weak. It means you choose to believe anyway. It means you speak God's promises over your life, even when it feels like nothing is changing. It means you wake up every day and say, Lord, I trust you, even when the circumstances are telling you not to. Faith is not about how you feel. It's about what you know. And what you know is that God is faithful. He has never failed you before, and he's not about to start now. The same God who has carried you through past battles is the same God who will carry you through this one. The same God who answered your prayers before is the same God who is working on your behalf now. You may not see it yet, but that doesn't mean he's not moving. He is always working behind the scenes, setting things in place, preparing the way, making sure everything aligns perfectly for the answer he has for you. Think about the people in the Bible who had to stand firm in faith despite their circumstances. Joseph was thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, falsely accused and thrown into prison. But he never lost faith in God's plan. He didn't let his circumstances define his belief. He stood firm, and in the end, God elevated him to a position of power, fulfilling the very promise that seemed impossible during his years of hardship. Daniel was thrown into the lion's den, but he didn't let fear shake his faith. He stood firm, trusting that God would deliver him, and God did. The 3 Hebrew boys refused to bow to the king's idol, even when faced with a fiery furnace. They stood firm, declaring that their God was able to save them. And even if he didn't, they still wouldn't bow. That's faith. That's unshakable trust. When you stand firm, you position yourself for the answer. You show God that your trust isn't based on circumstances, but on who he is. You tell the enemy that he has no power over your mind, your heart, or your future. You declare that no matter what happens, you will not be moved. And when you take that stand, God responds. He moves on behalf of those who refuse to be shaken, who refuse to give up, who refuse to let go of what he has spoken over their lives. God's answer is coming. It may not come when you expect it. It may not come how you thought it would, but it is coming. And your job is to stay in faith, to stand firm no matter what. Don't waver. Don't let doubt take root. Don't let the waiting make you lose sight of what God has promised. Keep believing, keep trusting, keep standing, because when the answer comes, you will look back and realize that every moment of faith, every decision to trust, every step you took in the dark was worth it. Stand firm. God is faithful. His answer is on the way. Don't give up when things get tough. Life will bring challenges, delays, and disappointments, but none of them change God's promises. When you pray and believe for something, there will be moments when it seems like nothing is happening, like the heavens are silent, like God has forgotten. But that is the moment when your faith has to rise. That is the moment when you have to make a decision. Will you give up, or will you keep believing? Will you walk away, or will you stand firm and trust that God is still working behind the scenes? Many people miss their breakthrough because they let go too soon. They get tired of waiting. They start to believe the lie that if it hasn't happened yet, it's never going to happen. But faith is holding on even when it doesn't make sense. Faith is saying, God, I don't see the way, but I know you have one. Faith is believing that even when the situation looks impossible, God is still in control. The waiting may be long, the struggle may be real, but the answer is coming. And if you don't give up, you will see it. The enemy's goal is to make you quit. He will whisper lies, telling you that your prayers don't matter, that your faith isn't working, that God has forgotten about you. He wants you to stop believing before the promise comes to pass. He knows that if he can get you to walk away, you'll never see what God had planned for you. That's why the battle gets hardest right before the breakthrough. That's why the pressure increases, why the doubts get louder, why the obstacles seem bigger. The enemy knows that if you hold on just a little longer, if you keep believing despite the difficulty, you will step into the very thing he's been trying to keep from you. So don't give up. Don't let the waiting make you think that God isn't working. Just because you don't see movement doesn't mean he's not setting things in place. Think about the people in the Bible who refused to give up even when things got tough. Hannah prayed for years for a child, and despite the heartache, despite the delays, she kept believing, and in due time, she gave birth to Samuel, one of the greatest prophets of Israel. Joseph was betrayed by his brothers, thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, and wrongfully imprisoned. Every step of the way, it looked like the dream God gave him was slipping further away. But Joseph never lost faith. He never gave up. And in the right time, God elevated him to the highest position in Egypt, fulfilling the very dream he had been holding on to for years. What if they had given up? What if they had walked away in the middle of the struggle? They would have missed the miracle. they would have missed the promise. The same is true for you. If you let go now, you might miss what God has prepared for you. You might walk away just before the breakthrough. But if you stay in faith, if you refuse to give up, if you keep trusting even when things are tough, you will see God's answer in your life. Waiting is never easy. It's uncomfortable, it's frustrating, and sometimes it feels like too much to bear. But God doesn't waste the waiting. He uses it to prepare you, to strengthen you, to build something in you that you didn't even know you needed. There are things He is working out behind the scenes that you can't see. There are pieces being moved into place that you don't even realize. If He answered too soon, you might not be ready. If He opened the door before the right time, you might not be able to walk through it. His delays are not denials. They are divine preparations. Every time you feel like giving up, remind yourself why you started. Remind yourself of the prayers you've prayed, of the promises God has spoken over your life. Remind yourself that God has never failed you before, and He's not going to start now. The same God who brought you through past struggles is the same God who is working in this one. The same God who made a way before will make a way again. He is faithful, He is trustworthy, and He will never let you down. The people who see the greatest miracles are the ones who refuse to give up. The ones who keep believing when it doesn't make sense. The ones who keep standing when everything around them says to quit. The ones who keep trusting when all the evidence says otherwise. Faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about believing even when you don't. It's about holding on even when it's hard. It's about trusting that God is still writing your story even when you don't understand the chapter you're in. Your breakthrough is coming. Your answer is on the way. It may not happen the way you expected. It may not come when you thought it would. But it is coming, and when it does, you will look back and see that every moment of waiting, every test of faith, every hard day was worth it. Keep going, keep believing, keep trusting. Don't give up when things get tough. Faith means walking with God, even in the dark. It's easy to trust God when things are clear, when the path is well lit, when you can see where you're going. But faith is not built in certainty. Faith is built in the unknown. Faith is walking forward when you don't have all the answers. Faith is believing that God is leading you even when you can't see the way. Faith is holding on to His promises when everything around you seems to be falling apart. There will be seasons in life when you feel like you're walking through darkness, when prayers seem to go unanswered, when the silence from heaven is deafening. Those are the moments when your faith is tested. Do you trust God when you don't understand? Do you keep walking when you can't see where He's taking you? Do you hold on to His word when nothing seems to be happening? That is the essence of faith, trusting God's plan even when it doesn't make sense. Believing His promise even when circumstances say otherwise. Abraham had to walk in faith. God told him to leave everything behind, his home, his family, his familiar surroundings, and go to a land that God would show him. He didn't have all the details. He didn't have a map. He didn't even know where he was going. But he believed God. He walked in faith even in the dark. And because he obeyed, because he trusted, God blessed him beyond measure. He became the father of many nations, and his descendants were as numerous as the stars in the sky. But what if he had refused to walk? What if he had waited for all the answers before stepping out? He would have missed the promise. Faith requires movement, even when you don't understand. It requires trust, even when fear tries to hold you back. It requires a deep confidence in God's character, knowing that He is good, knowing that He is faithful, knowing that He will never lead you anywhere He hasn't already prepared the way. You may not see the next step, but God does. You may not know how things will work out, but He does. And when you walk with Him, you are never truly walking in the dark, because He is the light. There will be times when you feel lost, when you feel like God is far away, when you wonder if He is even listening. That's when you have to remind yourself of His faithfulness. That's when you have to stand on what He has already done. Think back to the times He made a way for you before, the times He answered prayers, the times He provided, the times He protected you from things you didn't even know about. If He did it before, He will do it again. If He was faithful then, He is faithful now. His character does not change. His promises do not expire. And if He said He would do something, He will bring it to pass. Joseph had to walk in faith, even in the dark. God gave him a dream of greatness, but instead of seeing that dream come to pass right away, he was thrown into a pit by his brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused, and thrown into prison. From the outside looking in, it seemed like his life was going in the opposite direction of the promise God had given him. But even in the darkness of his circumstances, Joseph remained faithful. He trusted that God was still working, even when he couldn't see how. And in due time, God lifted him up, placing him in a position of power and fulfilling the very dream that seemed lost. The dark season was never meant to destroy him. It was preparing him for the promise. You may be in a season where you don't see the way forward. You may be facing delays, disappointments, or obstacles that seem impossible to overcome, but don't let the darkness make you doubt. Don't let the waiting make you walk away from what God has promised. Keep walking, keep believing, keep trusting that God is leading you, even if you don't understand where He is taking you. Just because you can't see it yet doesn't mean He isn't working. Just because you don't have the answer yet doesn't mean it isn't coming. Faith is not about knowing every detail of the journey. It's about trusting the one who is leading you. It's about surrendering your need for control and choosing to believe that God's plan is greater than anything you could imagine. It's about standing firm in His promises, even when circumstances try to shake you. When you walk by faith, you are not walking alone. God is with you. He is guiding you. He is preparing the way before you. And even if you can't see it yet, His answer is coming. God's answer might come in unexpected ways. When you pray, when you seek God, when you stand in faith, you often have a picture in your mind of how the answer will come. You imagine the timeline, the method, the circumstances surrounding the breakthrough, but God doesn't always move the way we expect. His ways are higher, His thoughts are greater, and His plans are beyond anything we can comprehend. Sometimes the answer you are waiting for is already in motion, but it doesn't look the way you thought it would. Sometimes God's response comes wrapped in difficulty disguised as a challenge, or hidden in the very thing you wanted to avoid. Many times in Scripture, people expected God to move one way, but He answered in a way that no one saw coming. When the Israelites cried out for deliverance from Egypt, they likely imagined a quick and easy escape. But God sent Moses, and instead of immediate freedom, Pharaoh's heart was hardened and things got worse before they got better. They had to walk through plagues, endure rejection, and step into the unknown before they reached the promised land. Their answer came, but not in the way they expected. When Jesus came as the Messiah, many thought He would establish His kingdom through political power, that He would overthrow the Roman government and reign as an earthly king. But God's answer was different. Jesus came in humility, born in a manger, walking among the people, healing, teaching, and ultimately giving His life on the cross. Many missed the miracle because they were looking for the answer in the wrong form. They were expecting a warrior, but God sent a savior. They were looking for a throne, but God brought a cross. The answer had arrived, but it didn't look like they imagined. God is not limited to human understanding. When you pray, He hears you. When you seek Him, He moves on your behalf. But you must be open to the way He chooses to answer. Sometimes what looks like rejection is actually protection. Sometimes what feels like a delay is actually preparation. Sometimes what seems like a closed door is God redirecting you to something greater. If you're too focused on your own expectations, you might miss the blessing that's already unfolding before you. Think about Naaman, the commander of the Syrian army. He had leprosy and went to the prophet Elisha for healing. He expected Elisha to come out, wave his hand, and instantly cure him. But instead, Elisha sent a messenger and told Naaman to dip in the Jordan River 7 times. Naaman was offended. The Jordan wasn't a grand or special river, and this wasn't the dramatic miracle he envisioned. He almost walked away from his healing because the answer didn't look the way he thought it should. But when he obeyed, when he surrendered his expectations, he was healed completely. God's answers don't always come in the obvious, expected way. You may be praying for financial breakthrough, and instead of sudden provision, He gives you an opportunity that requires faith and hard work. You may be praying for a relationship to be restored, and instead of an instant reconciliation, He takes you through a process of healing, forgiveness, and growth. You may be praying for direction, and instead of a clear, immediate sign, He allows you to walk by faith, trusting Him step by step. The answer is there, but it may not look the way you expected. When you trust God, you must also trust His methods. You must be willing to release your own expectations and believe that His way is best. The enemy wants to use disappointment to make you doubt, to make you think God isn't answering, to convince you that your prayers aren't working. But don't let frustration block your faith. Just because the answer doesn't look the way you imagine, doesn't mean it isn't on the way. Just because it isn't happening in your timing doesn't mean God isn't moving. Joseph never expected to become a ruler by being thrown into a pit, sold into slavery and imprisoned. But that was the path God used to bring him into his destiny. Ruth never imagined that picking up leftover grain in a field would lead her to Boaz and place her in the lineage of Jesus. David never thought that delivering food to his brothers would position him to defeat Goliath and step into his calling. None of them saw the full picture at the time, but they trusted God, and his answer came in ways they never expected. Faith means staying open to God's plan, even when it looks different than yours. It means believing that He knows what He's doing, even when you don't understand. It means surrendering your expectations and trusting that His way is always better. You may not see it yet, you may not understand it now, but one day you will look back and realize that God was working all along. His answer was never delayed, it was never forgotten. It just came in a way you didn't expect, but in a way that was exactly right. Trust in the process, even when it's unclear. Faith isn't just about believing in God's promises, it's about believing in His process. It's about understanding that the journey matters just as much as the destination. When you pray for something, when you stand in faith for an answer, you have to be willing to go through the process that leads to the fulfillment of that promise. And often that process won't be easy. It won't always make sense. There will be moments when you feel lost, when you wonder if God has forgotten you, when you don't see how things are going to work out. But faith is holding on in those moments. It's trusting that even when things seem unclear, God is still in control. God rarely takes people from promise to fulfillment without a process in between. Abraham was promised to be the father of many nations, but he had to wait years before Isaac was born. Joseph had a dream of leadership, but before he saw it come to pass, he was thrown into a pit, sold into slavery and imprisoned. David was anointed to be king, but before he sat on the throne, he spent years running from Saul, hiding in caves and facing battles. The process was never easy, but it was necessary. The process shaped them, prepared them, and strengthened them for the promise. There will be times when God allows you to go through a season of waiting, a season of struggle, a season of uncertainty. It's not because He has abandoned you. It's not because He's forgotten the promise. It's because He's doing something in you that you can't see yet. He's building your character, strengthening your faith, and preparing you for what's ahead. If He gave you the promise too soon, you might not be ready for it. If He took you straight to the destination, you might not have the endurance to sustain it. The process is where growth happens. The process is where faith is strengthened. When things don't go according to your plan, it's easy to get frustrated. It's easy to wonder why God is taking so long, why the doors aren't opening, why the situation isn't changing. But you have to remind yourself that just because you don't understand the process doesn't mean God isn't working. Just because it feels like nothing is happening doesn't mean He isn't putting things in place. What looks like a delay is often divine preparation. What feels like a setback is often setting you up for something greater. Think about the Israelites in the wilderness. God brought them out of Egypt, but instead of taking them straight to the promised land, He led them through the desert. What should have been a short journey turned into 40 years of wandering, but it wasn't because God had forgotten them. It was because they weren't ready yet. They had to go through the process. They had to learn to trust Him, to depend on Him, to develop faith that would sustain them in the land He was leading them to. If they had gone in too soon, they wouldn't have been able to handle the promise. There are things you've prayed for that haven't come to pass yet, not because God isn't answering, but because He's preparing you. There are doors that haven't opened yet, not because they won't, but because you're still in the process. The waiting isn't wasted. The struggle isn't meaningless. God is working in ways you can't see. He's aligning things in the background. He's shaping you, molding you, refining you, so that when the promise comes, you're ready for it. It's in the process that faith is tested. It's easy to trust God when things are clear, when everything is going according to plan. But real faith is trusting Him when you don't understand, when you can't see the way forward, when everything in you wants to give up. That's when you have to stand firm. That's when you have to remind yourself that God is faithful, that He has never failed you before, and He's not going to start now. The enemy will try to use the process to make you doubt. He will try to convince you that God isn't listening, that your faith isn't working, that you might as well give up. But don't let the process shake you. Don't let the uncertainty steal your trust. Hold on to what God has promised. Keep walking even when you don't see the way. Keep believing even when it doesn't make sense. Keep trusting even when it's unclear. Because one day you will look back and realize that every step, every delay, every challenge was part of something greater. The answer was always coming. The process was just preparing you for it. You're closer to your breakthrough than you think. It may not feel like it, it may not look like it, but the very thing you've been praying for, believing for, waiting for, could be just around the corner. The challenge with faith is that the closer you get to the breakthrough, the harder the enemy fights to make you give up. He wants to wear you down, make you question, make you feel like nothing is happening, like God isn't moving, like the situation isn't changing. But just because you don't see it yet doesn't mean it's not happening. Just because you don't feel different doesn't mean things aren't shifting. Sometimes the moment right before the breakthrough is the moment that feels the hardest. The pressure intensifies, the doubts grow louder, and the temptation to give up becomes stronger. But that's exactly when you need to stand firm. When a woman is in labor, the pain is the most intense right before the birth. The contractions become stronger, closer together, almost unbearable. But that's the very moment she is closest to seeing the promise, closest to holding what she has been waiting for. If she were to give up in that moment, she would never see the fulfillment of what had been growing inside of her. That's how it is with faith. When the battle is at its hardest, when the waiting feels unbearable, when you're tempted to let go, that's when you must hold on the tightest, because you're closer than you think. There are countless stories in Scripture of people who were right on the edge of their breakthrough, but they had to push through difficulty to get there. The Israelites had been wandering in the wilderness for 40 years, and finally they stood on the brink of the promised land. But before they could enter, there was one last test. They sent spies into the land, and instead of seeing the promise, most of them focused on the giants. They saw the obstacles instead of the opportunity, and because of their fear, they missed their breakthrough. Only Joshua and Caleb had the faith to believe that they were closer than they thought, that if God had brought them this far, He wouldn't fail them now. Because of their faith, they stepped into the promise, while the others remained stuck outside. Sometimes the enemy will try to use fear, discouragement, and exhaustion to make you forfeit your breakthrough. He wants you to settle, to stop believing, to turn back when you're right at the threshold of what God has promised. But you can't let temporary obstacles make you doubt an eternal promise. What if you're just one prayer away? What if you're just one step away? What if you're closer than you think, but you walk away too soon? Faith isn't about seeing the finish line. It's about believing it's there even when you can't see it yet. Elijah understood this kind of faith. There was a drought in the land and he prayed for rain. But after praying, he didn't see anything change. So he sent his servant to look toward the sea. And the servant came back saying, "There is nothing." That's where many people give up. They pray, they believe, but when they don't see immediate results, they stop expecting. But Elijah didn't stop. He told his servant to go look again, and again, and again. 7 times the servant looked and saw nothing. But on the 7th time, he saw a small cloud the size of a man's hand. That tiny cloud was the beginning of a massive rainstorm. The breakthrough was closer than they thought. It just required persistence, faith, and the refusal to give up too soon. Your situation may look the same today as it did yesterday. The door you've been praying for may still be closed. The change you've been waiting on may still seem far away. But what if today is the day things shift? What if tomorrow is the moment the breakthrough comes? What if you've been climbing the mountain, step after step, and you're just inches away from the top? You won't know unless you keep going. You won't see it unless you hold on. When Peter and the disciples were fishing all night and caught nothing, Jesus told them to cast their nets one more time. They were tired, frustrated, ready to give up. But they obeyed, and in that moment, the nets were filled beyond capacity. The breakthrough didn't come because they worked harder. It came because they didn't give up. It came because they trusted when it didn't make sense. You are closer than you think. The enemy wouldn't be fighting you this hard if you weren't close. The pressure wouldn't be this strong if you weren't right on the edge of something big. The waiting wouldn't feel this intense if God wasn't preparing something powerful. Hold on a little longer. Believe a little stronger. Keep pressing, keep praying, keep expecting. What God has promised is still on the way. The answer is coming. The breakthrough is near. Stay in faith because you are closer than you think.